In a quiet little town surrounded by endless fields of corn and wheat, there lived a man named Thomas. He wasn't rich or famous, but he was known for his hard work and kindness. Every morning before the sun rose, Thomas would wake up to take care of his farm. His hands were rough from years of labor, and his face carried the marks of long days spent under the open sky. The townsfolk respected him, not because he had done anything extraordinary, but because he always treated people with fairness and honesty. Thomas's family had owned the same piece of land for generations. It wasn't just soil to him. It was a part of his history, his identity. His grandfather had bought the land after returning from war, working tirelessly to turn it into something valuable. His father had continued the legacy, teaching Thomas everything he knew about farming. Now Thomas worked the same fields, growing crops that fed families across the region. To him, the land wasn't just property, it was home. But lately, life hadn't been easy for Thomas. A neighbor, someone he once considered a friend, had started making claims about the boundaries of their properties. According to the neighbor, a section of Thomas's land actually belonged to him. At first, Thomas tried to settle the matter, peacefully, explaining how the land had been in his family for decades and showing old maps as proof. But the neighbor refused to listen, and soon, lawyers got involved. What began as a simple disagreement escalated into a full-blown legal battle, dragging Thomas into a world he didn't understand and couldn't control. The courtroom was unlike anything Thomas had ever experienced. It was cold and formal, with rows of wooden benches and a large desk where the judge sat high above everyone else. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, and the silence was so heavy it felt like even breathing too loudly might cause trouble. Thomas felt out of place in his worn boots and faded jacket, standing beside men and women dressed in expensive suits. They spoke in complicated terms, using words he didn't fully understand, and every time he tried to explain his side, they interrupted him or shook their heads dismissively. On the day of the hearing, Thomas walked into the courtroom feeling nervous but determined. He had spent weeks preparing, gathering documents and photographs to support his case. He believed that if he could just tell his story, if he could make the judge see how much the land meant to him, then maybe she would rule in his favor. But as he took his place at the stand, he noticed the judge looking down at him with an expression that made his stomach churn. She seemed impatient, almost annoyed, as though she already knew what kind of person he was without hearing a single word. When it was finally his turn to speak, Thomas cleared his throat and began telling his story. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling inside him. "This land has been in my family for more than 50 years. My grandfather worked himself to the bone to buy it, and my father spent his whole life taking care of it. I'm doing the same now, trying to keep our family's legacy alive." As he spoke, he held up an old photograph of his grandfather standing proudly in front of the farmhouse, the fields stretching out behind him like a sea of gold. But before he could say another word, the judge cut him off. "Excuse me, Mr." She paused, glancing briefly at her notes. "Mr. Thomas, is it?" Her tone was sharp, dripping with sarcasm. "Could you please try speaking clearly? I can barely understand a word you're saying." The room fell, silent, every eye turning toward Thomas. His cheeks flushed red, and he felt his hands tighten around the railing in front of him. He had expected people to question his evidence or argue against his claims, but he hadn't anticipated being mocked for the way he talked. For a moment, Thomas didn't know what to do. He felt small, insignificant, as if the weight of the entire courtroom was pressing down on him. Memories of similar moments flashed through his mind. Times when people in cities or offices had laughed at his accent or dismissed him because of where he came from. Those experiences had always hurt. But this was different. This was his land, his family's history, and he wasn't going to let anyone belittle him. Not here, not now. Taking a deep breath, Thomas looked directly at the judge. His heart was pounding, but his voice remained calm when he spoke again. "Your Honor," he said, choosing each word carefully. "I may not sound like you or dress like you, but I assure you, I know this land better than anyone else in this room, and I'm here today to fight for it, for my family, for my future." There was a pause, a brief moment where no one moved or spoke. Then, slowly, Thomas placed the photograph back on the table and straightened up, ready to continue his testimony. The tension in the room was palpable, every person watching intently to see what would happen next. For Thomas, this was more than just a court case. It was a chance to prove that he deserved to be heard, no matter where he came from or how he spoke. And though he didn't realize it yet, the next few seconds would change everything. For him, for the judge, and for everyone else in that courtroom. Thomas stood there, his eyes locked with the judge's. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustle of papers being shifted on the lawyers' desks. Everyone waited to see what he would do next. Would he crumble under the pressure? Or would he find a way to stand his ground? For a moment it seemed like time itself had stopped. Thomas felt the weight of all those eyes on him, judging him not just for his words, but for who he was. But deep inside, something stirred. It wasn't anger or frustration, it was pride. Pride for his family, his land, and everything they had built together. He thought about his grandfather, who had worked until his hands bled to buy that piece of earth. He thought about his father, who taught him how to plant seeds and pull weeds, always reminding him to take care of the soil because it took care of them. And he thought about himself, waking up every morning before sunrise to keep the legacy alive. This wasn't just about winning a court case, it was about honoring the people who came before him. The judge leaned back in her chair, still wearing that look of superiority. She tapped her pen lightly against the desk, waiting for Thomas to respond. Her expression said it all. She didn't think much of him. To her, he was just another farmer with dirt under his nails and an accent that didn't fit into her polished world. But Thomas wasn't going to let her dismiss him so easily. "Your Honor," he began again, his voice stronger this time. "Let me tell you about my grandfather." He paused, letting the words sink in. He fought in 2 wars, risking his life for this country. When he came home, he didn't ask for handouts or special treatment. Instead, he worked harder than anyone I've ever known. He saved every penny he earned until he could afford to buy this land. Do you know why he did that? Thomas glanced around the courtroom, making sure everyone was listening. Because he wanted to give his family a future, a place where we could belong. As he spoke, Thomas pulled out another photograph. This one showed his grandfather standing beside a tractor, the field stretching endlessly behind him. His face was weathered, his clothes simple, but there was a spark in his eyes, a sense of purpose. This man, Thomas continued, holding up the picture, gave me more than just land. He gave me values, hard work, honesty, respect. Those are the things I live by every day. By now, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. People weren't just watching, they were listening. Some of the jurors exchanged glances, while others scribbled notes furiously. Even the opposing lawyer, who had been smirking earlier, now looked uncomfortable. Thomas could feel the tide turning, but he wasn't done yet. "And then there's my father," he went on, his voice softening slightly. "He taught me how to farm, yes, but he also taught me how to treat people. He used to say, 'Son, your word is your bond. If you promise something, you better deliver.' That's how we've always lived. That's how I've always lived." He pointed toward the documents laid out on the table. "Those papers prove that this land has been ours for generations, but even if they didn't exist, I'd still be standing here today, fighting for what's right, because giving up isn't something my family does." For the first time since the trial began, the judge stopped tapping her pen. She sat upright, her brow furrowed as though she was trying to process what she was hearing. Thomas noticed the change in her demeanor, but he didn't let it distract him. He kept going, pouring his heart into every word. "I'm not here to argue over lines on a map or technicalities in a contract. I'm here because this land is my home. It's where I grew up, where I raised my kids, and where I hope to grow old. You can mock my accent, Your Honor, but you can't take away what this place means to me." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. No one dared to interrupt him, not even the judge. Thomas felt a surge of confidence as he realized he had their attention. These people, no matter how different they seemed from him, were starting to understand. They might not have grown up on farms or worked the land themselves, but they knew what it meant to fight for something important. Finally, Thomas set the photograph down and took a step back. He had said everything he needed to say. Now it was up to the judge to decide. As he returned to his seat, he caught sight of the neighbor who had started this whole mess. The man avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. It was clear that Thomas's words had struck a nerve, not just with the judge, but with everyone in the room. Judge Miller, meanwhile, was struggling to maintain her composure. She hadn't expected this. When Thomas first walked into the courtroom, she had written him off as just another uneducated farmer with a sob story. But now she couldn't ignore the sincerity in his voice or the passion in his eyes. What he lacked in polish, he made up for in authenticity. And for someone like her, who prided herself on fairness and objectivity, that was hard to overlook. She glanced at the clock on the wall, realizing how long Thomas had been speaking. 30 seconds had passed since she last interrupted him, though it felt like much longer. In that short span of time, he had managed to transform the entire mood of the courtroom. People weren't bored anymore, they were invested, they cared about what happened next. And as the judge looked around the room, she couldn't help but wonder, had she misjudged this man? Her thoughts were interrupted when Thomas's lawyer stood up to present additional evidence. Maps, deeds, and letters from previous owners were submitted, each one reinforcing Thomas's claim. But none of it carried the same emotional weight as his personal testimony. By the time the lawyer finished, the courtroom felt different, charged with energy and anticipation. Judge Miller cleared her throat, signaling that she was ready to speak. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Thomas. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her tone noticeably softer than before. "Thank you for sharing your perspective. Please, continue whenever you're ready." It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. For the first time that day, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. He had faced mockery and judgment, but he hadn't backed down, and in doing so, he had earned the respect of everyone in the room, including the person whose opinion mattered most. Thomas nodded slightly at the judge's words, acknowledging her softer tone. He wasn't sure if she truly understood him yet, but he could see that she was listening now, really listening. That was enough for him. Taking a deep breath, he stood up again, ready to continue his testimony. This time there was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of the earlier embarrassment. He had found his footing, and he wasn't about to lose it. "Your Honor," he began, "I understand that laws and documents are important, but sometimes they don't tell the whole story. They don't show the late nights my father spent fixing fences or the early mornings I've spent planting seeds. They don't capture the laughter of my children running through these fields or the tears we shed when droughts hit and crops failed. This land isn't just lines on paper. It's alive. It breathes, it grows, and it gives back to those who care for it." As he spoke, Thomas gestured toward the large map pinned to the courtroom wall. It showed the disputed section of land, clearly marked in red. To most people, it probably looked like any other patch of dirt, but to Thomas it was so much more. "That piece of land right there," he said, pointing to the map, "is where my grandfather built his first barn. It's where my dad taught me how to ride a horse, and it's where I buried our old dog Max after he passed away. Every inch of it holds memories that can't be erased by arguments or lawsuits." The room remained silent, every person hanging on to his words. Even the opposing lawyer, who had been scribbling notes throughout the trial, stopped, writing, and looked up. There was something powerful about the way Thomas spoke, not just because of what he was saying, but because of how deeply he believed it. His passion was contagious, spreading through the courtroom like ripples in a pond. Judge Miller watched him closely, her expression unreadable. She had seen countless cases in her career, many of them involving property disputes. Most plaintiffs focused on technicalities, presenting charts and data to prove their point. Rarely did someone step forward and speak from the heart the way Thomas was doing. It made her question whether she had approached this case too quickly, dismissing it as just another argument over land. Thomas paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. Then, reaching into his folder, he pulled out an old letter. The paper was yellowed with age, its edges frayed from years of handling. "This letter," he explained, holding it up for everyone to see, "was written by the original owner of the land. He sold it to my grandfather back in 1952. In it, he talks about how proud he is to pass the land to someone who will take care of it. He even mentions the exact boundaries, which match the ones we're arguing about today." He handed the letter to the bailiff, who passed it along to the judge. As she read it, her eyes widened slightly. The handwriting was shaky, the grammar imperfect, but the message was clear. The original owner hadn't cared about legal jargon or precise measurements. He cared about trust and respect. Those values resonated with Thomas's testimony, creating a connection between the past and present that no one could ignore. "This isn't just about me versus my neighbor," Thomas continued, his voice steady. "It's about honoring promises. My family has kept theirs for decades. We've paid taxes, maintained the land, and respected our neighbors. All we're asking is for others to do the same." He turned to face the gallery, meeting the gaze of the people seated there. Some were farmers like him, while others were townsfolk curious about the outcome. Regardless of who they were, they all seemed moved by his words. The neighbor, sitting just a few rows behind Thomas, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Up until now, he had been confident in his position, certain that his wealth and connections would guarantee victory. But watching Thomas speak, hearing the raw emotion in his voice, made him uneasy. For the first time, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe this wasn't just a simple property dispute after all. Maybe it was something bigger, something worth fighting for. Back at the stand, Thomas took a moment to collect himself. He knew he had said everything he needed to say, but he wanted to leave one final thought with the court. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he said, his voice quieter now but still strong. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for fairness. If you look at the facts, if you really look at them, you'll see that this land belongs to us, not because of what's written on paper, but because of what's in our hearts." When he finished speaking, there was a collective exhale from the courtroom. No one clapped. That would have been inappropriate. But the tension in the air had lifted. People exchanged glances, nodding almost imperceptibly as though silently agreeing with Thomas. Even the judge seemed affected. Her earlier impatience had vanished, replaced by a thoughtful expression as she studied the documents before her. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the scratching of pens as lawyers and jurors jotted down notes. Then finally, Judge Miller leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas," she said, her tone measured but sincere. "You've given us a lot to consider. Let's take a short recess while I review the evidence." As the gavel struck and the courtroom emptied, Thomas returned to his seat, feeling both relieved and anxious. He had done everything he could to make his case, but now it was out of his hands. The next hour felt like an eternity as he waited for the verdict. Would the judge rule in his favor, or would all his efforts go to waste? During the break, whispers filled the hallway outside the courtroom. Spectators discussed what they had just witnessed, many expressing admiration for Thomas's courage and conviction. Some even approached him directly, offering words of encouragement. "You did great, Thomas," one elderly man said, patting him on the shoulder. "No matter what happens, you made your family proud." When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was different. The tension had eased, replaced by a sense of anticipation. Everyone filed back into their seats, waiting for Judge Miller to deliver her decision. She wasted no time, cutting straight to the point. "After reviewing the evidence and considering the testimonies presented," she announced, her voice firm, "I find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Thomas." A murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by quiet applause. Thomas sat frozen, unable to believe what he had just heard. It took a few seconds for the reality to sink in. He had won. The land was his. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he blinked them away, standing up to shake hands with his lawyer. The neighbor offered a reluctant handshake as well, though it was clear he wasn't happy about the outcome. Still, something had changed between them during the trial. Perhaps it was Thomas's heartfelt speech or the undeniable strength of his case. But whatever it was, it softened the animosity that had driven them apart. As Thomas left the courthouse later that day, surrounded by friends and supporters, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Winning the case wasn't just about keeping his land. It was about proving that hard work, honesty, and determination could overcome even the toughest challenges. And as he drove home, the sun setting, over his fields he knew one thing for sure: his family's legacy was safe, for now and for generations to come. The victory in court felt like a dream to Thomas, but it wasn't the end of his journey. It was just the beginning. As he drove back home that evening, the golden fields glowing softly under the setting sun, he couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The trial had been more than just a legal battle. It had been a test of character, a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. For days after the verdict, people in town talked about nothing else. News of the farmer who stood up to mockery and won spread quickly, turning Thomas into something of a local hero. At first, Thomas didn't know how to handle the attention. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. Back at the farm, life went on as usual, feeding the animals, checking the crops, fixing broken fences, but now neighbors stopped by more often, bringing pies or simply wanting to chat. Some shared stories of their own struggles, saying they found inspiration in the way Thomas handled himself in court. Others offered advice on how to deal with fame, though Thomas laughed off the idea. "I'm no hero," he'd say with a shrug. "I just did what I had to do." Despite his humility, the impact of his victory reached far beyond the small town. Local newspapers picked up the story, describing how a simple farmer had turned the tables on a judge who underestimated him. One headline read, "Courage in the courtroom, how a farmer's words changed everything." Reporters called asking for interviews, but Thomas politely declined most of them. He didn't want to dwell on the past. He wanted to focus on the future. Still, there was one request he couldn't ignore: a letter from a school teacher in a nearby town. The letter arrived a week after the trial, handwritten on plain stationery. In it, the teacher explained that she had shown her students an article about Thomas's case. Her class, mostly children from farming families, had been inspired by his courage and determination. They wanted to meet him to hear his story firsthand. At first, Thomas hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and he worried he wouldn't know what to say. But then he thought about his own childhood, how much it meant to him when someone took the time to teach or encourage him. With a sigh, he agreed to visit the school. On the day of his talk, Thomas walked into the classroom feeling nervous. The room was filled with curious faces, some shy, others eager to ask questions. The teacher introduced him warmly, calling him a man who taught us all the power of standing up for what's right. Thomas smiled awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "Well," he began, "I'm not sure about all that. I'm just a farmer, same as any of you might grow up to be." He started by telling the kids about his grandfather and father, sharing stories of hard work and sacrifice. He showed them the old photograph of his grandfather standing beside the tractor, explaining how every scratch and dent on the machine told its own tale. Then he pulled out the faded letter from the original landowner, letting the children pass it around carefully. Their eyes widened as they touched the brittle paper, imagining the history it held. When it came time for questions, the kids surprised him with their curiosity. "Were you scared in court?" one boy asked. Thomas chuckled. "Of course I was," he admitted. "But sometimes being scared doesn't mean you stop. It means you push through anyway." Another child raised her hand. "What did you feel when the judge made fun of you?" Thomas paused, thinking carefully before answering. "I felt hurt, sure. But instead of letting it get to me, I decided to show her and everyone else who I really am. Sometimes people don't understand you until you make them listen." By the end of the visit, the classroom buzzed with excitement. The teacher thanked Thomas, telling him how much the students had learned from him. As he left the school, he noticed a group of boys pretending to be lawyers and judges, reenacting scenes from his trial. One of them even mimicked his accent, shouting dramatically, "This land is my home." Thomas laughed, shaking his head. Maybe he hadn't changed the world, but he had certainly made a difference in this little corner of it. Back at the farm, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be. The neighbor, whose name was Harold, seemed to have cooled down after the trial. Though their relationship remained strained, Harold occasionally waved when they crossed paths, a gesture Thomas appreciated. One afternoon, while working near the disputed boundary line, Thomas spotted Harold walking toward him. His heart skipped a beat, unsure of what to expect. But instead of starting another argument, Harold stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat. "Look, Thomas," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "I may not agree with the court's decision, but I respect how you handled yourself. You're a good man, and, well, maybe I got carried away." Thomas blinked, taken aback by the apology. After a moment, he nodded. "We all make mistakes, Harold. What matters is how we move forward." The two men shook hands, a silent truce forming between them. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. As weeks turned into months, Thomas found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned, not just from the trial, but from the aftermath. He realized that standing up for himself hadn't just been about winning the case. It had been about proving to himself that he was worthy of respect, and in doing so, he had inspired others to do the same. Whether it was the school children dreaming of their futures or Harold learning to admit when he was wrong, Thomas's actions had sparked a ripple effect that extended far beyond his fields. Even Judge Miller seemed affected by the experience. Rumors circulated that she had requested transfers to rural districts, seeking to better understand the communities she served. While Thomas never confirmed whether these rumors were true, he liked to think that his testimony had planted a seed of change in her mind. After all, sometimes the smallest acts of courage could leave the biggest impressions. One crisp autumn morning, as Thomas stood on the porch of his farmhouse watching the sunrise, he felt a deep sense of peace. The land stretched out before him, vast and unchanging, yet full of life. Each blade of grass, each tree, and each patch of soil reminded him of the generations who had come before him, and those who would follow. He knew challenges would arise again. Life on a farm was never without its struggles. But for now he was content, knowing that he had fought for what mattered and emerged stronger because of it. Thomas turned and headed back inside, ready to tackle another day of work. As he passed the old photograph of his grandfather hanging on the wall, he paused for a moment, smiling softly. "Thanks, Grandpa," he murmured. "You'd be proud." Then, grabbing his hat and gloves, he stepped out into the fields once more, ready to continue the legacy that had shaped his life. The seasons changed, and so did Thomas's life. Winter gave way to spring, and the fields that had lain dormant under blankets of snow began to awaken. The air smelled fresh and clean, carrying the promise of new beginnings. For Thomas, this time of year always brought a sense of renewal, a chance to start over and focus on what truly mattered. But this spring felt different. It wasn't just the crops growing in his fields, it was the growth he saw in himself and those around him. Since the trial, people in town treated Thomas differently. They didn't just see him as the quiet farmer who kept to himself anymore. Now they saw him as someone who could stand up for what was right even when the odds were stacked against him. Strangers approached him at the local diner or the feed store, thanking him for inspiring them to face their own challenges. Some shared stories of personal struggles, battles with illness, financial hardships, or conflicts with neighbors, and how his example had given them hope. Thomas listened patiently, offering words of encouragement whenever he could. He never considered himself a role model, but he understood the importance of lending a hand when someone needed it. One day, while picking up supplies at the hardware store, Thomas ran into an old friend named Margaret. She owned a small bakery in town and had known Thomas since childhood. "You've become quite the celebrity," she teased, handing him a bag of nails. Thomas laughed, shaking his head. "I'm no celebrity, Margaret, just doing my job." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Well, whether you like it or not, you've made an impression. And speaking of impressions," she hesitated, glancing toward the counter where a young girl stood quietly clutching a notebook. "That's my niece, Emily," Margaret explained.
"She's visiting from the city and she's been following your story. She wants to be a writer someday and she's hoping to interview you for her school project." Thomas glanced at the girl, who looked both excited and nervous. Her wide
eyes reminded him of the students he had spoken to at the school months earlier. After a moment's thought, he nodded. "Sure, why not? I'll answer whatever questions she has." Later that afternoon, Emily sat across from Thomas at the kitchen table, scribbling notes furiously as he recounted his story. She asked thoughtful questions, digging deeper than most adults would have. "What was the hardest part about standing up to the judge?" she asked at one point. Thomas paused, thinking carefully before answering. "The hardest part wasn't the judge herself. It was doubting myself. For a moment, I wondered if maybe she was right, if I didn't belong there. But then I remembered who I was fighting for. Not just me, but my family and everything we've worked for. That gave me strength." Emily nodded, jotting down his response. When the interview ended, she thanked him profusely, promising to send him a copy of her finished project. True to her word, she mailed him a neatly typed essay a few weeks later. Reading it, Thomas was struck by how much detail she had included. Not just about the trial, but about the values he had emphasized. Hard work, honesty, and resilience. At the bottom of the page, she had written a note. "Thank you for teaching me that it's okay to be proud of who you are." As summer approached, Thomas noticed other changes too. The community seemed closer somehow, united by the lessons they had taken from his experience. Neighbors helped each other more often, sharing tools, advice, and meals. Even Harold, whose dispute had sparked the entire ordeal, became less distant. Though their relationship wasn't perfect, they found common ground in their shared love for the land. One evening, Harold stopped by unexpectedly, bringing a basket of fresh vegetables from his garden. "Peace offering," he said gruffly, though his smile hinted at something warmer. Thomas accepted the gift graciously, inviting Harold to stay for coffee. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset, they talked about farming, weather patterns, and the unpredictability of life. By the end of the night, they weren't just neighbors, they were friends. But perhaps the most surprising development came from Judge Miller herself. A letter arrived one morning, postmarked from a rural county several hours away. Inside was a handwritten note from the judge, explaining that she had requested a transfer to oversee cases in smaller communities. "Your testimony stayed with me long after the trial ended," she wrote. "It reminded me of the importance of listening, not just to the facts, but to the people behind them. Thank you for teaching me that lesson." Thomas read the letter, twice, feeling a mix of emotions. He hadn't expected any acknowledgement from the judge, let alone gratitude. Yet her words resonated deeply with him. Everyone made mistakes, including judges, and it took courage to admit them. Folding the letter carefully, he tucked it into a drawer alongside the old photograph of his grandfather and the faded deed to his land. These items represented pieces of his journey, reminders of where he had come from and how far he had come. With autumn approaching, Thomas decided to host a small gathering at the farm. He invited neighbors, friends, and even a few reporters who had covered his story. It wasn't a celebration exactly, but rather a way to express his gratitude. "This land doesn't just belong to me," he told the crowd, gesturing toward the field stretching out behind him. "It belongs to all of us, to our families, our histories, and our futures. Together we can make sure it stays strong." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Thomas felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had faced adversity and emerged stronger because of it. More importantly, he had inspired others to do the same. Whether it was through interviews, conversations, or simple acts of kindness, he had planted seeds of change that would continue to grow long after he was gone. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the gentle rustle of wind through the trees, Thomas reflected on the past year. It had been a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, pride, and joy, but through it all, he had stayed true to himself. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "Hard work pays off, son. Always remember that." Smiling softly, Thomas closed his eyes, knowing he had honored his family's legacy in every possible way. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was ready for whatever came next. After all, he had learned that no matter how tough things got, standing your ground and staying true to yourself could move mountains, or at least win back a piece of land you loved. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened, and the fields that had once been lush with crops now stood bare, their bounty safely stored away for the winter. Thomas spent his mornings tending to the last of the harvest, his afternoons fixing equipment, and his evenings sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Life on the farm was quieter now, but it was a good kind of quiet, the kind that let him think, reflect, and appreciate how far he'd come. One chilly evening, as he sipped a cup of coffee and listened to the distant call of geese flying south, Thomas found himself thinking about the trial again. It wasn't something he dwelled on often. After all, there was always work to be done, but every so often memories of that day would surface, reminding him of the lessons he'd learned. He thought about the judge's sharp words, the way they had stung at first but ultimately pushed him to dig deeper into who he was. He thought about Harold, whose apology had surprised him, and how their renewed friendship had taught him the value of forgiveness. Most of all, he thought about the countless people who had reached out to thank him, not just for winning the case, but for showing them that it was okay to stand up for themselves. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to notice more signs of the impact his story had made. A local artist painted a mural in town depicting farmers working together under a bright blue sky. At its center was a figure that looked remarkably like Thomas, standing tall amidst golden fields. When he saw it for the first time, he laughed, shaking his head. "I don't look that heroic," he muttered to himself, though secretly, he felt proud. The mural became a symbol of unity, drawing visitors from neighboring towns and sparking conversations about community and resilience. Then came the invitations. Schools, churches, and community groups started asking Thomas to speak at events. Some wanted him to share his story. Others simply wanted him to offer advice on dealing with adversity. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he was the right person for such responsibilities. But Margaret, his old friend, encouraged him. "You've already inspired so many people," she said one afternoon while delivering fresh bread to the farm. "Why stop now? Just tell them what you told me. Life is tough, but you can get through anything if you stay true to yourself, taking nay." Her words to heart, Thomas accepted a few invitations. His talks were never polished or rehearsed, he didn't have time for that, but they were honest. He spoke about his family, his struggles, and the importance of perseverance. He shared stories about his grandfather's determination and his father's wisdom, weaving them into lessons that resonated with audiences of all ages. After each event, people lined up to shake his hand, thanking him for his courage and candor. "You've given us hope," one woman said, tears glistening in her eyes. "We need more people like you in this world." Word of Thomas's speaking engagements spread quickly, eventually reaching someone unexpected, a filmmaker named Rachel. She specialized in documentaries about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and she believed Thomas's story deserved to be told. One crisp November morning, she arrived at the farm unannounced, camera slung over her shoulder and notebook in hand. "Mr. Thomas," she said, extending her hand, "my name's Rachel. I'd love to make a short film about your journey. Would you be open to it?" Thomas scratched his chin thoughtfully. Cameras weren't really his thing, but he could see the sincerity in Rachel's eyes. Besides, if sharing his story could help even one person feel less alone, then maybe it was worth it. "All right," he said finally. "But no fancy editing or dramatic music. Just keep it real." Filming took place over several weeks, capturing everything from Thomas plowing the fields to him visiting the school where he'd spoken months earlier. Rachel interviewed neighbors, friends, and even Harold, who admitted on camera that he had underestimated Thomas during their dispute. "He's a better man than I am," Harold said with a sheepish grin, "and I'm glad we worked things out." When the documentary premiered at a small theater in town, the entire community turned out to support Thomas. As the lights dimmed and the screen lit up, he sat nervously in the front row, unsure of what to expect. But by the end of the film, the audience erupted into applause, whistling and cheering as though he were some kind of hero. Thomas stood awkwardly, waving briefly before ducking out of the spotlight. He didn't need the attention. He just wanted people to focus on the message. The documentary went on to win awards at regional film festivals, bringing even more recognition to Thomas and his town. Reporters wrote glowing articles calling him a voice for rural America and a testament to the power of authenticity. Yet despite the accolades, Thomas remained grounded. Fame wasn't what mattered to him. What mattered was using his platform to remind others of their own strength. Whether it was through speeches, interviews, or casual conversations, he continued to spread the same simple message. No matter where you come from or how you talk, your voice matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Winter arrived, blanketing the farm in snow and forcing Thomas indoors for long stretches of time. He used the opportunity to catch up on repairs, organize old photographs, and write letters to people who had reached out to thank him. One letter came from a young soldier stationed overseas, who wrote that Thomas's story had reminded him of why he was serving, to protect places like the farm, where families built lives rooted in hard work and love. Reading those words brought tears to Thomas's eyes. He hadn't set out to inspire anyone, yet somehow his actions had touched lives across the country and beyond. By spring, the cycle began anew. Snow melted, seeds were planted, and the fields sprang back to life. Thomas worked alongside his son, teaching him the skills his father and grandfather had passed down. Together, they repaired fences, checked irrigation systems, and planned for the future. Watching his son grow into his role on the farm filled Thomas with pride. This land wouldn't just belong to him forever. It would belong to the next generation, and the one after that. As he stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced challenges, fought battles, and emerged stronger because of them. More importantly, he had shown others that they could do the same. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he knew he wasn't alone. His family, his neighbors, and even strangers who had been moved by his story, all of them were part of something bigger than themselves. Life on the farm was simple, but it was rich with meaning. Every blade of grass, every rustling leaf, and every patch of soil carried the weight of history and the promise of tomorrow. And as Thomas stepped inside, closing the door behind him, he smiled softly, knowing he had honored his family's legacy in every possible way. The land was safe, the community was strong, and his voice, once mocked in a courtroom, had become a beacon of hope for anyone brave enough to listen.